Hello everyone, thank you for being here. Thank you, Lynn, for those kind words. It's always a bit nervous when you run an event like this that you actually all show up, so you're all here, and it gets bigger every year, and we sold out 3 times this year, so that's kind of cool too. So I think it shows the commitment and dedication to tackling this issue. So as Lynn was saying, 3 years ago today, we did at this conference have Roseanne Haggerty here, a former thinker in residence, and she invited us to think about the problem of homelessness, and she set us a challenge. She said to us that Adelaide is uniquely placed to lead on the issue of street homelessness, and that we could be one of the first communities to solve it. 1 year later, as Lynn said, at this same conference we launched our community's response in the form of the Adelaide Zero Project. And Jake McQuire, one of today's keynote speakers, he was here at that conference, and he, along with the team at Community Solutions, have been helping us ever since to address this issue. So 2 years on, we've made extraordinary progress. I'd like to share some of that with you and our thoughts on next steps. But first of all, I'd like just to start with a little bit of a reminder about what we're trying to achieve. So really, what we're trying to do is solve a problem. And we need to get better as a society at solving problems, because you might have noticed increasing amount of angst around the world and how that plays out in political context and those sorts of things. But if we don't get better at solving society's problems, this is what happens. We criminalise problems like homelessness, which is what was happening in Melbourne and Sydney in 2017. But if we solve problems, this is what it looks like. This is what a growing community and a growing number of communities and cities in the United States have done. They've focused on this problem, and they've focused on ending the problem of street homelessness. So one of the things that we learned from Jake and the team at Community Solutions is that to solve problems like this, we need to better understand the nature of the problem we're trying to solve. As John Falzon said in his piece recently, and we'll say later on today probably, that when the people who define what the problem is will determine how we understand. The way we define the problem and the way we understand the problem will define what we do about it. So my apologies to anyone who's been very involved in the Zero Project and some of the community briefings that we've had. Some of this might be a little bit familiar, but when you are trying to understand the nature of a problem, you need to understand what type of problem you're solving. So simple problems, as many of you may have heard, are things like baking a cake. When you follow the recipe, when you put the same ingredients in, you get the same result. That is, unless you're shocking in the kitchen, which some of us are. Complicated problems are like landing a person on the moon. It seems impossible when you first start, but once you figure it out, once you calculate for all the variables, once you've done it once, like they did with the Apollo missions, you can do it again and again and follow roughly the same process. It's still complicated, but it can be done again. Anyone who's a parent understands what complex problems are. And since last year's conference, I became a parent. This is my little bub called Sophie. Anyone who raises a child knows that if you raise them in a loving, nurturing environment and you do all the right things, and in the moment their cousins or their children, other children come along, you can't do the same thing and expect the same result. Raising children is a complex problem because when people are involved, it is complex. The problem of homelessness is one more step of complexity. The problem of homelessness means there are people involved, so it's complex, but there are multiple levels of complexity going on. Health issues, affordability issues, and economic context in which those people live. So we need to understand that the nature of the problem we're trying to solve is incredibly complex. And when you understand that, then you can set about using the right tools to solve that problem. And as the saying goes, if all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So for simple and complicated problems, initiatives, programs, facilities, buildings, instruction manuals, recipes, these things will work. But for complex and wicked problems, they don't. We need systems change, as the Minister was saying, and we need collective approaches to tackling those problems, to solving them. So that's what we've taken, a systems change approach to this wicked problem, and we've tried to work in as collaborative a way as possible. And we've focused on the inner city and people sleeping rough. And we've not done this because homelessness in the inner city is the most visible form of homelessness, which it is, or because the fact that the image of people sleeping rough on the streets confronts us and shames us as a society, and as we walk past someone sleeping rough, it pierces the sort of bubble of privilege that most of us live in every day. We're not focusing on those for those reasons, and we're not focusing on street homelessness because it's the most costly form of homelessness in terms of government budgets. Why we've chosen to focus on this issue is because it's the most costly form of homelessness in terms of life expectancy. When someone sleeps rough on the streets of our streets, it impacts on their life expectancy. It reduces their life, it shortens their life, and people die while they sleep rough. And that has happened year after year here in the city of Adelaide. So we have focused on rough sleeping for this reason, and we focus on the city because it's where the problem is most concentrated. In the last census in 2016, there were approximately 400 people who were sleeping rough. Now that is a little out of date, and we know that the current figures is about 215 people sleeping rough in the city tonight. So that's about half the rough sleepers in South Australia are in the CBD. Slightly out of date numbers, but it gives you a sense of the problem. So that's why we're focused on this problem. But we're also trying to break the problem up. And we know that we can't deal with this problem on our own. City councils, service providers, housing providers, government agencies. So the only way to so once we have an understanding of the nature of the problem and we break it up, we can have a better chance of solving the problem. And as Desmond Tutu once wisely said, that there's only one way you can eat an elephant, one bite at a time. What he meant by this was that everything in life that seems daunting, overwhelming, and even impossible can be accomplished by gradually staying focused and working on it piece by piece. So this is what we've done, and over the past 2 years, this is what we've been able to achieve. We've created and kept up to date a by-name list of every single person sleeping rough in the Adelaide CBD. We've released this data publicly for the purposes of improvement, not judgment, and we've used this on a public dashboard. In Connections Week, we will go out with the whole community and count how many people were sleeping rough and make a connection with them as individuals. And we did this thanks to the leadership of the Hutt Street Centre, we've now done this twice, and this year we had a record 280 volunteers go out as part of 28 teams. And we now, as a consequence, have the most comprehensive data on homelessness in Australia for people sleeping rough. That's a pretty incredible achievement. To do this and everything else, we've drawn upon the support and the expertise right across the broad coalition of over 45 different partner organisations. And I'd like to pay tribute to all of them today here, obviously the organisational leaders for the investments and the time and commitment they've made, but particularly to the staff and the organisations involved. Those staff have really driven the collaboration across the different organisations that we work in. And we have a broad range of other businesses and other organisations that are part of this project. But one of the most boring parts of the project, but potentially one of the most interesting and most important, is this. This is our governance structure. And if we're going to solve complex problems, we need the right people in the right rooms at the right time, focused on the right solutions. And we need to get better at doing that, and that's what we have over the last 2 years. There's no doubt this governance structure is complicated and it isn't perfect, and we need to keep improving it. But right now, we should celebrate the successes we've had, because next week, the 14th of August, will mark 2 years that we've had the CEOs and leaders of all of the organisations and service providers in the city coming together to meet monthly. 2 years the CEOs have been coming together to do that. I think that's an incredible sign of the commitment to what we're trying to do, and a good success in and of itself. But other than that, we've also had continuing levels of massive collaboration improvement that happen between the Inner City Committee of Practice, which works on the coordination of care and housing and the housing allocation process for people on the by-name list. I would argue that this is the engine room of the project, and the people in this room who are part of that should be incredibly proud of the work they do every week. We have a strategic data working group focused on inflow, we have a line housing group focused on outflow, and we have underpinned all of this work by the support and advice we receive from our international partners. So for the nearly 2 years, the Don Dunstan Foundation has acted as the independent backbone support for this whole project, working to help pull this all together. And as many of you know, and as Lynn just mentioned, I'll be finishing up as Executive Director, but the Dunstan Foundation is committed to supporting the Zero Project for the next 2 years in the role of championing the collective impact approach that we've driven. And the collective impact approach obviously driven through the 5 different priorities that you can see here as part of this pyramid. They've been central to how we've worked together and how all the different organisations involved in the project have supported what we're doing in different ways. And so the biggest achievement, I guess, is we've had 183, as of this week, housing placements through the project. That's 183 people who were sleeping on the streets and now in housing placements, and we've done that in 14 months. This is a phenomenal achievement and a testament to the hard work of everyone involved in the project, including the support of the Housing Department and the Housing Authority, as the Minister mentioned, providing the lion's share of that housing. This is a massive achievement, and if you look at how quickly we've done it, 183 people in 14 months. They had a 50 Lives, 50 Homes campaign in Brisbane and in Perth, sorry. It took them 2 years to do those 50 lives, and we've done 183 in 14 months, just for one point of comparison. There's other initiatives in Brisbane as well, so we really smashed it out of the park there. And we've done this by hard work, by being data-driven and using the processes and structures that I talked about before. But we've also done this by learning the lessons of the past, because South Australia is a leader in tackling homelessness and tackling street homelessness. In 2009, we reduced homelessness to 40 people, approximately. And one of the lessons we learned at that time is that homelessness isn't just an issue of housing, it's as much an issue of health as it is about housing. And this is what our data shows. The data from the by name list shows that 54% of the people who are sleeping rough this week have more than one of these health conditions going on in their life at this point in time. And what it reveals is that further analysis is needed. What the data and the analysis that we've done shows is that fundamentally the system that is there to support people who are sleeping rough is broken. This is what we found. This is the data since we've started collecting. This is the most comprehensive data in Australia that I was mentioning. And despite the massive increase in the number of people we've housed, homelessness continues to rise. We now have 226 people sleeping rough on our streets. Part of the good news, though, is that the number of people who've been sleeping rough on the streets has reduced. The amount of time people have been sleeping rough on the streets has reduced, so 27%. It used to be 35% last year. That is a sign that our system is improving, the sign that all of the work and the collaboration that we're doing, as well as the fact that we're housing a record number of people, which shows that we are making progress. But the number of people who've been sleeping rough in the inner city for more than 2 years is still 54%. Aboriginal people are still overrepresented, and 60% of the people who sleep rough lack meaningful daily activities. So the challenge we have is that whilst we're housing more people and we're improving the system, we've housed that record number of people. We've had 384 new people come into the system over that same period. That shows that prevention is half the battle, at least half the battle, and that's why it's the focus of this year's conference. Prevention needs to be about addressing the housing affordability crisis in this country. It needs to be about addressing the fact that you can't afford food and rent on New Start, but it also needs to be about the fact that we need to follow the data and use it to inform how we act each and every day in this system. We cannot wait for statewide strategies, for organisational strategic plans, for procurement, for other reform processes, as important of all of those things are, to make improvements. It's on all of us every day in the way that we work in this system to be more nimble, to be more responsive to the needs of the people who rely on that system. So, in terms of next steps, yes, of course, prevention needs to be a big part of the battle, and we need to support the Raise the Rate and Everyone's Home campaigns, as I was mentioning. But there are a number of other next steps. We'll continue to work to improve the quality of our by name list, and we'll use this to inform our responses, as I was saying. There are a number of sessions later today on communicating the importance of data, and this will help us to ensure that we don't just collect and admire data, but that we use it to improve service responses. One area of focus that we need to improve is in relation to Aboriginal homelessness in the city. Another way in which we'll continue to seek to improve the quality of our by name list is through the work that NEMI are doing, through transitioning to a national database and further rolling out the Common Assessment Tool. Through the research that's been funded by Anglicare, we'll have a greater sense of how we can turn off the tap of those people who are coming into the system. And we have a number of recommendations from the Lord Mayor mentioned from the Institute of Global Homelessness report that we still need to implement to support innovation in our system. For example, the establishment of an emergency fund and an inner city services coordination hub. We'll be updating this report later in the year when Noni Brennan from All Chicago, a leader in homelessness from the United States, comes to Adelaide as a thinker in residence. Baptist Carer continuing to engage with some of the great peer support workers in our sector to strengthen the voices of people with a lived experience. In this project, and you can hear more about the peer support workforce in a workshop later today. We of course need to do more to improve access to housing, and we need to have greater innovation in the housing system, we need greater investment in the housing system, we need more appropriate housing and a change to the mix. We need to create greater throughput through the housing and shelter systems. And we need to continue to engage with the public and the business communities if we are to work in a collective way to solve this problem, because we can't solve it on our own. And finally, connected to all of this, we need to engage the Commonwealth as a partner in this work. We've been very successful in building a broad coalition, but we haven't involved the Commonwealth in as much as we should, and we need to. And so one of the things that needs to be a big focus, and as the Lord Mayor mentioned, one of the things that really needs to be a big focus is the housing and homelessness strategy at a national level that the Lord Mayor mentioned that we needed. And that's, I think, that the functional zero approach that we've pioneered here in South Australia and we are training the rest of the country on for the rest of this week needs to be taken national and needs to be supporting other communities to do what we're doing, because ultimately what we're doing won't be successful if we don't tackle this as a nation. So there's more opportunities to learn and discuss all of these things throughout the day, through the mini presentations and other things. But one final thought I'd like to leave you is that, as the Minister said, as the Lord Mayor said before and the Minister said, we live in a country that is so affluent. We have the longest period of economic growth this country has ever seen, and we are now facing rising and higher levels of homelessness. In a city and a country as prosperous and livable as ours, we can and we must do more to address this problem, but we need to remain focused on fixing and solving this problem, not just addressing it. And the problem isn't street homelessness in the inner city. The problem is we need to solve the problem. The problem is that it is actually possible. The thing that we're trying to do is to prove that it's possible to end homelessness, just as other communities around the world have done. A growing number of them are doing it. And so whilst that is a challenge, it's a harder, more complicated task than putting a person on the moon, as we talked about earlier. But to quote a slightly more inspiring president of the United States than the incumbent, we choose to do this not because it is easy, but because it is hard. Thank you for being here.